Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board game designers. These are creators and authors, to people who produce and make the games that you and I enjoy. And as far as I'm concerned, board game designers are probably the biggest factor, the biggest criteria that I consider in purchasing a game, even more so than the ranking on BGG or the mechanisms or the publishers or the components or even the theme. I consider who has designed this game and if it's a designer that I trust and have enjoyed their games in the past. Now, for the making of this list, I do have some criteria to limit the persons who qualify for this list. So, for example, if I have not played at least 3 designs of the designer, and I enjoyed at least 3 of their designs, then they're not even going to factor into this list. So if I've played a couple of games, 1 or 2 games that I've enjoyed, but that's all I have to go with, they're not going to count or qualify for the making this list. Now, as far as this list, I'm going to rank it from 10 to 1 as is usual, but I'm also going to share with you all the games I've played from each of the different designers, and I'm also going to share with you their highest ranked game on BGG that I have played of theirs, and I'm also going to share a game that I have yet to play, but I'm hoping to play in the near future. Finally, I'm also going to share a characteristic of each of the 10 designers that distinguishes them from all the other designers on this list and that I've learned to love and appreciate in each of them. So without any further ado, let's get straight into the list. My number 10 board game designer is Donald X Baccano. And Donald X Baccano is a little bit of a polarizing designer. Lots of people love and adore and are enamored with his designs, while other people don't want to touch his games with a 10-foot pole. I happen to be in the camp of people who enjoy his games. Now, among his designs that I've played include Kingdom Builder, a former Spiel des Jahres winner with lots of expansions out there. Lots of different ways of scoring, and a lot of it is, connections. You have a little bit of route network building, if you will, and some area majority and area enclosement taking place. You also have Temporum, another design of his. This is a science fiction space travel or time travel actually themed game, which is really in essence an area majority game with a little bit of a thin layer of theming as far as the time travel is concerned, but the play is well executed. Now, his highest ranked game on BGG that I have happened to play, and it's also his highest ranked game on BGG, and that is Dominion. And Dominion here is the grandfather of the ever so popular, ever so prevalent deck building genre. And this too is a former Spiel des Jahres winner. So Donald X Baccano has 2 Spiel awards in his resume. That's pretty impressive. Not too many designers can say that. And Dominion here is going strong 14 years later. So much expansion content. They're still releasing expansions till this date. So Donald X Baccano is still milking this cow for what it's worth. And I'm okay with that because I appreciate this game so much. Now, a game of Donald X Baccano that I have yet to play, but I'm looking forward to playing in the near future. I actually have it right here. And that is Android Infiltration. And this game is part of the Android universe from Fantasy Flight Games. And just like all the Android games in Fantasy Flight's catalog, it happens to be out of print. So we can't attribute it solely to Donald X Baccano because lots of the other games, including the popular Android Netrunner, seem to be unavailable at the moment. But this game here takes place in that theme, and players are all... It's kind of like a semi-cooperative game from what I gather. Players are all breaking into a building, trying to hack for information and what have you. But at the same time, the deeper you go, it's a little bit of a press your luck, and you're trying to get more information, classified information. But it's also riskier because once the police are called and eventually this threat dial triggers that, you got to race out and make it outside of the building to even qualify for the win, and whoever has collected the most data or what have you is the winner of the game. Sounds like a really cool game to play, in particular in groups, and I'm excited to see what this has to offer. Now, as far as a characteristic that distinguishes Donald X Vaccarino from all the other designers on this list. Not to say that none of the other designers don't have this going for them, but this is what his forte is, and that is his variability in games, in particular, setup variability. Donald X Vaccarino, all his games that I've played, Kingdom Builder, Temporum, Dominion, they're very modular in nature, so the combinations and the permutations of all the different game components is almost infinite. Dominion, for example, with all the expansions, forget about it. You're never going to play the same game twice unless you absolutely want to. Kingdom Builder has some expansions and lots of modular pieces, including scoring cards and modular boards and different special action tokens. Temporum has all these different ages that you're trying to travel back into, and there's so many different ages to choose from. So that's kind of a thing for Donald X Vaccarino. If you want to have setup variability in your games, Donald X Vaccarino is king of that particular niche. So my number 10 board game designer, Donald X Vaccarino. Now we'll move on to my number 9. And my number 9 board game designer is Mike Elliott. And Mike Elliott has a few games of his that he's designed that I've played and have enjoyed. That includes Star Trek Fleet Captains, which is an epic, grandiose two-side game where one player takes on the Federation and the other player takes on the Klingon forces. If you buy expansions, then you can introduce the Romulans and the Dominion as well. He's also created Dice Masters along with Eric Lang. We also have Dragonfire, which is a spin-off of an original series of his. It's a deck-building cooperative game, very unique though from lots of other deck builders, and very tough to win. But Dragonfire happens to be within the Dungeons and Dragons universe, and his representative game that I've chosen for this list, the game that's highest ranked on BoardGameGeek.com of his, is Thunderstone Quest. And Thunderstone Quest here, another deck building game, is a fantasy-themed deck-building game that at this point is in its third iteration, its third edition, and at this point is a full-blown dungeon crawl with a separate side to the board, which is your dungeon. Your dungeon, which consists of 6 different rooms that the players can delve into and go deeper into, provided that they have enough light, and fight different monsters at different levels. Not so cool because you're going back to the village and you're leveling up and you're buying new characters, you're buying additional weapons and items and magic spells to strengthen your deck. As you level up your different characters, you're actually destroying or culling your deck of some weaker, lower leveled cards, so your deck always stays very manageable and very small and very predictable, which is a good thing in a deck building game. Really cool, really neat. I just love how the dungeon crawl element is incorporated and combined with the deck building in this game, Thunderstone Quest. Now, as far as a game of Mike Elliott's that I hope to play in the near future, I am thinking of Shadowrun Crossfire, which is the original game from which Dragonfire stems off from, and it takes place in the Shadowrun RPG universe, which is a different and distinct and very diverse universe. So that is a game that I look forward to playing from my number 9 board game designer. A characteristic of Mike Elliott is his utilization of theme. His games feel very, very thematic. Sometimes they might even suffer mechanically speaking, but not at the expense of the theme. So that's something that I appreciate from Mike Elliott. So now let's move on to my number 8 board game designer, and that is Friedemann Friese. And Friedemann Friese, I've played Copycat, I've played 504, I've played Fabled Fruit and Friday, I've played Terra, and 5 Cucumbers. Friedemann Friese is a very prolific designer. I've played other games like his, like Fool and America, the trivia game. Now, the representative game of his, the highest ranked game on Board Game Geek that I happen to have played of his, very popular game, and that is Power Grid. And Power Grid, I can't stop singing the praises of this game. It's a pretty heavy Euro game of his, pretty lengthy as well. Love playing it. It includes lots of mechanisms that have been combined and gel and work well together. You got route network building, you got an auction that takes place at the beginning of each round for the different power plants that you're trying to control. You have a shopping phase where you purchase a bunch of different resources, but you have to have capacity for the resources, and you have this track that tells you the worth of each of the resources, and there's a little bit of a supply and demand element. As you have more of the resources, they're a little bit cheaper. As you have fewer of them, they're a little bit more expensive. And finally, you have a lot of money management. And this game is so cool because the end of the game can really sneak up on you if you're not prepared, if you're not ready, because it's not a fixed ending. The game is triggered once a player has built a certain amount of cities. And you really got to be ready just in case the player triggers that at any given moment. Really fun, classic game of his, almost 20 years old at this point. I believe the original German edition is over 20 years old at this point. Power Grid. Now, as far as a game of Freedom and Freeze that I have yet to play, that I'm looking forward to playing, hopefully in the near future, we've got Power Grid Factory Manager. And this game here plays very different from Power Grid, from what I've heard. It kind of takes place within that universe, if you will. But mechanically speaking, it's a totally distinct game. And I'm really looking forward to playing this. Freedom and Freeze, as far as the characteristic that distinguishes him, is his creativity. He's really an obviously outside the box thinker, and I really appreciate that. Now, sometimes he goes too far outside of the box, and that might actually hurt his board game designs, but I have to commend him and appreciate the fact that he's brave enough to push that envelope and even attempt some of the things that he's attempting. Lots of other board game designers stay within their comfort zones. Lots of other board game designers fall into the trap of being one-trick ponies, if you will, just for the sake of success. But Freedom and Freeze, he pushes that envelope and still finds a way to create some really good games along the way. My number 7 board game designer, or number 8 board game designer, Freedom and Freeze. Now we move on to my number 7. And my number 7 is Michael Kiesling. And I've played a good amount of Michael Kiesling games over the years. We have the Mask trilogy of games that he co-designed with Wolfgang Kromer, and that's one thing about Michael Kiesling. Not only does he partake in lots of co-designs, but in particular, he has a dancing partner that he goes back to time and time again, and that would be Wolfgang Kromer. And he co-designed Tikal, Cusco, and Mexica. I like all of those games. Tikal is by far my favorite, and it's the only one of those 3 that's actually a Spiel des Jahres winner, so lots of people, I guess, would agree with me. He also co-designed games like Cold Baron and Adventureland, along with Wolfgang Kromer, but he does have individual designs that have been met with success. He has Sansuchi, which I think is a pretty good game. We have Riverboat, which is a really good game. I really like Riverboat. And finally, the representative game, the highest ranked game on Board Game Geek that I happen to have played of his, and I believe it's his highest ranked game, period, and that is Azul, the very popular former Spiel des Jahres winner, gateway game, which is really an abstract game. I happen to prefer Azul Stained Glass of Sintra more than the base game, but I enjoy the base game a lot as well. This game is really good as well, the original or vanilla Azul. Popular, pretty, beautiful game. His number 1 ranked game on BGG. A game of his that I've yet to play. I'm going to actually consider 2 games that I want to play. Because first of all, I'm going to consider a co-design with Wolfgang Kromer of his, which is Porta Nigra. I want to get this game played. It looks like a beautiful game design. But besides this co-design of his, I'm also interested in playing Vikings, which is a out-of-print game of his that I'm probably going to have to buy used if I ever want to get that. Now, a characteristic of Michael Kiesling that I appreciate is his utilization of space, his manipulation of the spatial element of his games. In all of his games, at least the ones that I've played, it seems that space is a crucial and key element, which makes lots of his games almost feel like abstract games, which is why it's no surprise to me that his most successful game is this beautiful, elegant design of Azul. And that's it as far as my number 7 board game designer of all time, Michael Kiesling. Now we move on to my number 6 board game designer, and that is Richard Garfield. And Richard Garfield has been at it for quite a long time. And that's one of the things about most of the designers on my list. A lot of these guys are veterans in the gaming industry. And part of that is kind of like with my direction of this channel as a focus on classics and older games. So obviously I'm going to focus a lot on these older board game designers. And Richard Garfield here Lots of the games I played of his include Magic the Gathering, obviously, very popular game, his claim to fame. Games like King of Tokyo, very successful filler of a game. We've got Keyforge, one of his more recent card games. We've got Robo Rally, which was his first game design, which he originally actually made back in the 80s, although it wasn't published until the early 90s. And of course, we have Treasure Hunter, which is a cool take on the pick and pass card drafting mechanisms with a nice fantasy theme to it. And the representative game of his that I'm using, his highest ranked game on Board Game Geek, is Android Netrunner. And technically, Android Netrunner is a Lucas Litzinger design, but the original game, Netrunner, was first designed by Richard Garfield back in the mid-1990s. And that game was not as successful as his first attempt at a collectible card two-player tactical game, which was Magic the Gathering, and that's probably why he kind of was competing with himself. So that game wasn't successful, it died out, but eventually it was brought back by Fantasy Flight, and Lucas Litzinger kind of reinvented it. Now, I've never played the original Netrunner, so I guess I can't even guarantee that I would have liked that gaming system, but we're still going to give Richard Garfield the credit for this brilliant design. I think this is a very fun game. The biggest challenge with this game is how asymmetric it is. The terminology and the wording is a little bit so cumbersome that it makes it a little bit of a challenge to teach it to another player. Till this date, I've only taught this to one other person, and that's the person that I get my Android Netrunner fix with. Richard Garfield's highest ranked game on BGG, Android Netrunner. Now, a game of his that I am looking forward to playing that I've yet to play is Bunny Kingdom. And this looks like just a straight up Euro game from designer Richard Garfield, and he doesn't really do straight up Euros. His thing is card games, really. And we have lots of cards in this game, so I guess there is an element of card drafting. I've not played it, as I've mentioned, but I'm really excited about this game. The components and the board, the grid here really call out to me, and I think there's a good chance that I'm going to like this game, so excited about that. Now, as far as a characteristic that sets Richard Garfield apart from his colleagues or his contemporaries is his mastery of card play. I feel like he has found ways to reinvent card play, to diversify what you can do with cards, stemming from Magic the Gathering, which basically spawned an entire genre of games, the collectible card game, the trading card game, and the living card game, and even the deck building genre all kind of owe their existence to Magic the Gathering. But he's continued to do that with other games of his, even games like Robo Rally and King of Tokyo. He has all of these potential upgrades that you can use through the form of cards. He's done it with Treasure Hunter and card drafting, all these different types of cards that do different things for you. So yeah, that's his characteristic, his mastery of card play. Now we're going to move into the top 5 of my board game designers, the cream of the crop. These are my absolute 5 favorite board game designers. And my number 5 is Wolfgang Kromer. Now, just a few entries back, I had Michael Kiesling, his frequent dancing partner. They collaborate and work together on co-designs all the time. I think a good chunk of their resume are co-designs. So repeated mentions of the Mass Trilogy to Tikal, Cusco, and Mexica. Good games of his that I've played. Adventureland, Coal Baron. Really good games. Now, some games that he's worked on apart and separate from Michael Kiesling include Colosseum, which is also a co-design with yet another designer. Downforce, which was one of his earlier designs from as far back as the 1970s. I've played the Restoration Games edition, which has kind of been revamped by other designers, including Rob Daviau. So I'm not so sure how the original game played, but I'm giving Wolfgang Kromer credit for the original design. And his representative game of his, the highest ranked game on BGG that I have played, actually. I'm not going to pull out the box because it's enormous, and that's El Grande, the grandfather of the area control, area majority genre. Very classic, elegant take on the area majority mechanism. El Grande. Now, a game or games of his that I've yet to play that I'm looking forward to include the previously mentioned Porta Nigra, co-designed with Michael Kiesling, and some games of his that I'm looking forward to that are not designed with Michael Kiesling include Six Nimt. I think that's how it's pronounced. It actually doesn't have any vowels in it, and that's a classic card game of his that I've heard a lot about over the years, but I've yet to try that game out. And also Sealand, which is a Euro game that he co-designs with some other designer. Can't think of his name off the top of my head, but it's not Michael Kiesling, and that's a game that has caught my attention in times past. Now, a characteristic of Wolfgang Kromer that distinguishes him is the use of majorities, in particular the majorities in different spaces, area majority. He's gone back to that. He's revisited that time and time again. We have games like Mass Trilogy series. These games kind of revisit the area majority that he first invented in a game like El Grande. But you also see that take place in Coal Baron. Coal Baron is a worker placement game of his, but the way the worker placement works is you cannot simply just block a particular action space by placing a worker there. Instead, a person can come after you and take that same action as long as they put one more worker there than what was already currently there. So I find his utilization of majorities, in particular with space and sometimes with other things like workers, I find that to be a characteristic of his that I see time and time again in different gaming designs of his. My number 5 designer of all time, Wolfgang Kromer. My number 4 board game designer of all time is Reiner Knizia. Yes, the doctor himself, the most prolific board game designer of all time. This gentleman accounts for more Board Game Geek entries than any other single individual in the entire database. Hundreds upon hundreds of board games he has designed. Now, I myself have played about 60 of those designs, so I'm not even going to begin to mention all of them, but I will state a few for the record. Some of his more notable games that I have played include Amun-Re, Taj Mahal, Hollywood Golden Age, Blue Moon City, Tower of Babel, Palazzo, not to mention his highest ranked game on BGG that I have played as of yet, and it's his highest ranked game as well, and that is Tigris and Euphrates. And while this game does not rank for me personally as high as lots of the other games that I mentioned, I do appreciate it, which is why it's still in my collection. It's a very interesting take on area majority and also conflict. There is some battle taking place, as the game refers to it, internal versus external conflict. This game plays very well at 2, 3, or 4 players. There's some tile lanes, some tile placement going on. This here's the modern edition from Fantasy Flight Games, so I like the components here as well. Really cool, really neat. Now, as far as games of Reiner Knizia that I have not played, that I hope to play in the near future, the number one that stands out right now is My City, which is Reiner Knizia's take on the, not only on the legacy concept of games, this is a legacy game of his, but it's also his take on polyomino tile placement. So basically players are building their cities, and their cities consist of all these different tiles that they place on their city board, and they're Tetris-like shaped, lots of different polyomino shaped tiles to place down. And the game takes place over the course of 12 sessions, is it? 24 sessions. So I'm really excited to see Reiner Knizia's crack at the legacy style game. That's the game of his I've yet to play. Now, as far as a characteristic, besides the fact that he's prolific and he is the hardest working person in the board game hobby, another characteristic of his is his mathematical integration of games. He is a PhD in mathematics, and he shows it. All of his games factor in lots of mathematical elements, from auction bidding to the geometric composition of his boards. Everything is planned precisely to the minute mathematical detail. So if you gravitate towards math, if that's something that appeals to you, then you're gonna like Knizia games. Now, at the same time, sometimes the theming in his game can be a little thin, and if you are a thematic gamer, you're probably not going to be interested in Knizia games. But if you can just kind of suspend disbelief, if you will, long enough to immerse yourself in the mechanisms of his game, they're very, very sound. That's why Reiner Knizia is my number 4 board game designer of all time. My number 3 board game designer of all time is Stephanfeld. And I have played a decent amount of Stephanfeld games, and as many of the designers on my list, Stephanfeld has been doing this for a long time and has quite the resume, very prolific designer indeed. And games that I've played of his include games like La Isla, Macau, Notre Dame, In the Year of the Dragon, Trajan, and the representative game of his, the highest ranked game on Board Game Geek that I have happened to have played of his, is Castles of Burgundy. And this game here is a game where players are trying to fill their individual player boards, which consists of a hexagonal grid of a bunch of different spaces, which represents their estate. And there's like 5 or 6 different terrain types within that estate that players are trying to draft tiles from the main board in each of the different depots in order to place them onto their grid and fill as many spaces as possible and complete as many sections and score points for said sections. The interesting thing about this game is players are rolling dice, and the dice will determine what they can do with their actions, because all of the spaces on the main player board, along with the individual player boards and all the different tokens and actions, correspond to the different pit values on the dice. So you got to utilize those dice wisely. There is some dice mitigation with some worker tiles that allow you to modify your dice rolls by 1, either +1 or -1, and you could use up to multiples, several of these worker tokens in order to mitigate to your heart's content. But you do need to take turns in order to even draft these worker tokens to begin with. Really cool classic game of his. I also have played the card game iteration of it and the dice game implementation of this game as well, and enjoy those as well. Now, as far as games of Stephanfeld that I have yet to play that I'm looking forward to, one of them includes Amerigo, this big game right here. Big box game from Queen Games. And in particular, I'm interested in seeing Stephanfeld's use of the cube tower. This is cube tower that players will dump these cubes into, and these will grant them particular actions for that round. I'm always interested in seeing Stephanfeld's way of utilizing cubes for actions in his different games. Now, as far as a characteristic that distinguishes Stephanfeld, as you might imagine, it's point salad. Stephanfeld, his games include so many different ways of scoring, and they all seem viable paths to victory. He is the best at this point salad thing. He actually makes it work. My number 3 board game designer of all time, Stephanfeld. And now we move on to my number 2 board game designer. My number 2 is Bruno Cathala. And from Bruno Cathala, I've played a bunch of games, including Dice Town. I've played Cyclades, Shadows over Camelot, Cleopatra and the Society of Architects, Yamatai, King Domino, and Jamaica, to name a few. The highest ranked game of his that I've played on BGG is 5 Tribes, which is a game that has Mancala and a lot of point salad, as I mentioned about Stephanfeld earlier, where there's so many different ways of scoring points. And basically, you grab all the meeples that are in a particular tile. You could choose whichever tile to start from, and then you move them along the board, and you can move as far as you want as long as you have 1 meeple to drop off in each tile that you traverse through. And finally, the tile that you end up in has to have the meeple color matching the last meeple you drop off there. And then based on the colored meeple, you can trigger a particular action. And there's so many different ways of scoring. There's some area control taking place as you empty particular tiles. You place your camels to indicate that you have control of that area and that you'll score its corresponding points at the end of the game. There's some set collection with these different cards, these different resource cards that you're drafting throughout the game. There's some gins that grant you special benefits, in-game benefits, and also some victory points at the end of the game. You're also building oases and palaces that will grant you additional points, and even your money will score points for you at the end of the game. Really cool. I really enjoy this game, and there's a reason why it's the highest ranked on BGG of his 5 Tribes. Now, as far as games of Bruno Cathala that I have yet to play that I'm looking forward to playing in the near future, one of them would have to be Queen Domino, which is the younger sister to King Domino, and it makes King Domino a more complete game because King Domino is a great entry-level gateway game, a game to introduce to children even. Queen Domino here has a little bit more going on to it, so I am looking forward to getting this game to the table. Now, as far as characteristics of Bruno Cathala, I had a hard time coming up with characteristics of his, and one of the reasons why is because his characteristic is how different his games kind of feel from one another. I'm not saying they're as outside the box as, let's say, a Freedom and Freeze, but they all feel different. He tries different types of games with each of his designs, and sometimes if you don't see his name on the box, you can't necessarily tell that it's a Bruno Cathala game. So that's my number 2 board game designer, Bruno Cathala. And now we move on to my number 1, and some of you might have suspected it, and that's Uwe Rosenberg. And Uwe Rosenberg, very prolific designer, as I've been mentioning about lots of the guys on this list, with the exception of Wolfgang Kromer and Uwe and Rainer Knizia. He's probably the one who's made the most games on my list. Games of his that I've played include Le Havre, Le Havre Inland Port, Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, Agricola, Patchwork, Glass Road, At the Gates of Loyang, Mercator, and his number 1 game ranked on Board Game Geek that I happen to have played is Caverna. And even though I happen to be on the camp of gamers who prefer Agricola over Caverna, Caverna is a great alternative. It's a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more generous than Agricola, and it has an interesting, fantastical dwarven cave theme applied to it. So it's a neat alternative for me. A worker placement game where players are growing their families, but on top of just trying to grow their families and breed their animals, partake in animal husbandry and some farming, planting of vegetation, they're also going into the caves and mining them for different resources like rubies, and they are excavating them and building cave taverns in them, or caverns in them, for them to dwell in, some dwelling spaces for them. And they're also going on quests, on expeditions, in order to gain other additional resources and victory points. Really cool. Caverna, really highly ranked. Now, as far as a game of his that I've yet to play, that I'm looking forward to playing soon, very soon, that would be Fields of Arle. And Fields of Arle here is, again, a typical Uwe Rosenberg worker placement game with a medieval setting and an agricultural theme to it. But this here is only for 2 players. It's a big box game that's only for 2 players. It's his only big box 2-player only game. He does a lot of 2-player only games, but they're always smaller boxes. So this one here looks very grandiose with lots of worker placement options, it appears to be, on the board. Really excited about this. If you want to play this with 3 players, you can buy an expansion for it that ups it to 3 players, but you can never do more than 3 players. So that seems to be really exciting. Fields of Arle. Now, as far as a characteristic of Uwe Rosenberg that I see in lots of his games, it's the way he's able to combine abundance with restriction. Lots of his games include lots of pieces and components and buildings and cards and resources, lots of things that you can play with and enjoy, lots of options in theory, but at the same time, little subtle restrictions that prevent you from doing everything. Caverna is kind of an exception to that rule, but not so much. There is some restrictions, or there are some restrictions in Caverna as well. Le Havre, one of his more generous games, there are some restrictions in Le Havre. And all of his games like Agricola, are notorious for how much choices you have at face value, but at the same time, how much restrictions you also have, because you have to account for so many different things. So that's the characteristic of his games that have an abundance of options, but at the same time, restrictions that kind of hold you back. And I appreciate that in his games. Some people don't like that. They feel handcuffed and find that to be a detriment as far as his game design is concerned, but I kind of like it. As long as the rules are clear about it and you know what you're getting yourself into, I'm okay with games that can be that strict. And that's it. My number 1 board game designer of all time, Uwe Rosenberg. That's it for my top 10 list, folks. Please comment down below. Tell me who's your favorite designer of all time. Maybe a list of your top 5 or top 10 even. Tell me what you think about my top 10 designers. Perhaps games that I have not mentioned of theirs. Maybe I have not played them. Maybe I need to add them to my future bucket list of games to play. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. That's it for today's video, guys. Thank you for joining us. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.